Good evening. Welcome to Talk Gnosis. This evening we are being joined by Deacon John Digillio of the HAC as we discuss narcissism. In the past, we've discussed topics like Gnostic elitism, and this topic was actually introduced by Bishop Laney Peterson. Hello, Bishop Peterson.
Hello.
Maybe you want to give us a little clarity on this topic.
Yeah, I actually started thinking about this. We've in the past discussed the issue of Gnostic elitism. Do Gnostics as a group, as a community, think of themselves as being better than others, but also is Gnosticism an inherently elitist religion? But I wanted to take this, pull this back into more of an individual issue for people. We hear the term narcissism a lot in our culture these days. We hear the term self-entitled, self-absorbed, these terms, and I thought it would be interesting to discuss whether the practices of modern Gnostics makes us narcissists or it contributes to narcissism, as well as whether it leads us into an unhealthy form of self-absorption. I'm not talking tonight about narcissistic personality disorder. That is a psychiatric diagnosis that is fairly extreme and fairly rare. I'm just talking about an unhealthy regard for self, but also a regard for self that leads us to not pay attention to others or the people around us. And when I was thinking about this, I was wondering, well, who would be a great guest? And of course, the Deacon John Digillio is one of my favorite people and one of my favorite guests, but he also has a lot of practice in Eastern religion, Eastern meditation. So I thought he would be a great person to have on the show to talk about this topic. He also does a lot of great community work. And I know how he interacts with people in a way that's very selfless and very giving. So I thought, this is the man I want on the show. So welcome, Deacon.
Well, hello, both Bishop Ken and Bishop Laney. It's a pleasure to be back here. I will say I've been sitting here giggling. I'm glad to know I was brought on because of doing work in the community and because of Eastern practices, not because of my own narcissism.
I was trying to clarify that. I didn't want to say, my favorite person, John DiGilio on narcissism. No.
It's a pleasure to be back.
Good. Glad to have you back. So why don't we just kind of launch right in here? I know that I've had some people say to me that various Gnostic or esoteric practices is all a bunch of navel gazing, and some people have also some Buddhist practitioners have had the similar charge leveled at them. What do you have to say about that?
Well, it's not something that I would say is totally grounded in misunderstanding. There's a lot of misunderstanding there, but human nature says we observe something and we interpret it in our own way. So, as a Buddhist, do I sit and meditate? Absolutely, of course, it's a big part of my practice. Is there a lot of navel gazing involved? Absolutely. The big difference is, and the same thing with Gnosticism, is it's sort of, what's going on behind the scenes. Are you simply sitting there to put on a show? Are you studying for the sake of, again, appearing knowledgeable? Or is it actually you're doing something more? What are your intentions in this? If one's intentions are selfish, well then, yes, we're going to have that bit of selfishness pops in. But I think if you truly take time to understand Gnosticism, take time to understand Eastern religions, it really is about something bigger. It's about everybody and how the little things that you do actually have an effect on the greater whole.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a key thing there, that there is we talk about the word mindfulness, and I might suggest that a crux of that is, okay, yes, there's the mindfulness of what you are currently doing and who you are, but there's also how am I in relation to other people? How am I taking up space here? I think that's critical. Would you say, Deacon?
Absolutely. And like I said, that's the thing that I think we miss as observers. So when we see the practices that other people are doing, it's easy for us to say, oh, well, this is what it looks like. But until you take the time to understand what's going on, and then as you begin to compare, the similarities between what a Buddhist is doing compared to what a Gnostic is doing, compared to what a Catholic is doing, for example, you start to see these same habits, these same stories. But for some reason, we have that inability to see beyond our own practices to make that leap. So I agree completely.
Very good. Bishop Canterbury,
Hmm.
do you
Well,
have anything to ask?
absolutely. I mean, I think some great points put on it, and again, I would have to stress, you know, as we've discussed many times, where do these practices lead? If it is simply about being self-absorbed, if it is about just one's own ego, yeah, there's some negativity there, but most sincere, people I've met who are, sincere on the path of Gnosis, it's not just about themselves. There is a sense of community. There is a sense of helping out others, of kind of seeing the big picture. Almost everyone I know who's involved in Gnostic churches, even those who work individually, tend to be really big on doing things that are geared towards community service, helping out the needy, helping out the poor, giving back in some way. And I don't see that as narcissistic behavior. When you first, this, topic, I'm going, okay, well, are we kind of beating a dead horse because we've talked about Gnostic elitism so much? But once, I kind of figured where you're going with this. I totally understand when you're talking about, do these practices start to the point where they're only start feeding our own ego?
Yep, exactly.
And I would say that maybe for some people that might be in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that these practices, if one continues with them, that it stops being about the individual ego.
So would you agree with that, Deacon DiGilio, that the idea that the more you do it, that the repetition and the actual, as we say, practice over time actually can minimize that egoism?
I do. And in fact, if you look at the world's great religions, another thing that we all have in common is this idea that we teach people the necessity of subduing the ego or transcending the ego. So if what you're doing is simply feeding your ego, for a beginner, that's fine. We all have to start somewhere. Yeah. We have to first identify what the ego even is. Mm-hmm. So, but as Bishop Ken says, you come to a point where you've either transcended this and you understand what's happening, on the whole through the interconnectedness. But if you're still feeding your ego, you're doing something wrong, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. So it's not that it doesn't happen. We see it every day. And, again, if you look at the great traditions, Jesus was known for saying, to people, take care of yourselves first. Then take care of one another. These are the things you need to do. The Buddha said the same thing. Be a lamp unto yourself. He didn't mean be a lamp unto only yourself, but in the becoming a lamp unto yourself, that light begins to shine that others may see it. So even with Gnosticism, we say the idea of recognizing that each one of us is unique and has our own path means that we do a lot of work for ourselves. But at the same time, we can't help but encounter other people on the same paths or on their own paths. There's no getting away from this. And if that's the thought that one has going into it, then one has to question the very reason for the practice to begin with. But I think, again, once you look beyond, what we see externally, and unfortunately, we've also got this divide in the way we practice today, and that you have so many people who, again, believe that there's something you have to do, but there is that group that believes that it's all external, that, salvation, nirvana, whatever you want to call it, is going to come from somewhere else, someone else. So in many ways, the entitlement actually can be seen as flowing the other way. People get this idea that if I just keep asking, I will receive. But there's a corollary, again, once you get behind the basics, that says a lot of asking is understanding what you're asking about, what it means to you, what it means to others.
Would we say that then this is perhaps for some people a developmental milestone, just as we've talked on this show about how children develop and they sit, they crawl, they sit, they stand, that on the spiritual path at some point there's this developmental milestone of, okay, we become self-centered at first because that's all we have to work with, and just being self-aware in and of itself can be a real achievement for some people. But then ideally you move beyond that and become far more aware of others around you, and then ideally the divine. But that's a milestone that not everybody reaches or achieves.
Exactly. And maybe in many cases, in the Christian sense, most of us are raised to believe that you have this one life. Whatever happens now determines where you'll be after death. When you take it to the Eastern religions, and again, I can speak only as a Soto Zen practitioner, they have a much more patient approach to this. In fact, a lot of Buddhists will tell you you're born over and over again, and your actual development is the result of lifetimes of work. So there's not this sense of urgency that, you're going to get this one chance and that's it. But this idea that it really is a gradual, slow process. And, studying something like Zen meditation, for example, when you're first introduced to your cushion, I promise you in my case, probably the first couple of years was spent doing oh, my back hurts. How long have I been sitting here? What exactly am I getting out of this? Will somebody please say something? That sort of thing. And eventually you realize that there's something more to this practice, and you're watching others do it. And there's this whole idea that as you're taking care of yourself, you actually are taking care of everyone else. The more time you spend cultivating your own mindfulness, the less time you're spending out there doing more selfish things. You can't be out there causing harm, causing hurt, doing these other things if you're so focused.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the more important things in Gnosticism that I tell people that this Gnosis begins with self-knowledge. And a lot of people don't really understand what that means because they don't really know themselves. And this is incidentally the human condition. I'm by no means claiming any special gifts in that area. And the process of self-knowledge, I think, oftentimes does require outside assistance, whether through a teacher or through a religion or a religious practice or through a psychotherapist. But that process of self-knowledge can be incredibly painful.
Yes.
And a lot of people take one look at it and run screaming the other direction, quite understandably. So in my own experience, the path of self-knowledge has not led me to have a very high opinion of myself when I can actually see these really horrible things that I think and do and say and how I hurt others. And again, it's an issue of continuous revelation, and I don't think we're ever going to end that. So, yeah, I mean, for me, I would say that if a practice begins with self-knowledge, that focus on self, if one is being honest or is learning to be honest, can certainly be one that is not going to give one a very high opinion of oneself.
And I think, you hit kind of the key word there is, being honest with oneself. And I think, unfortunately, sometimes, especially for beginning practitioners, and this isn't picking on beginners because we've all been there.
Yeah.
But I think that many times we create a distortion or an illusion of ourself in beginner, and I call it the neophyte phase, where I don't care what particular organization one is affiliated with, but you tend to have a bunch of beginners who see themselves as being perfected, that they're already spiritually attained, that they already know everything, that there's nothing that they can learn. But again, the more that they continue with practices, the more that they start becoming aware of themselves, the more that they start breaking down these illusions, the more that they start becoming self-aware, and they're seeing their flaws, and they're seeing the work that actually needs to be done. So I'll have to go back to, to my kind of beginning idea is that, I think that there is a bit of ego, a bit of narcissism, possibly in the beginner, but I think that anybody who kind of sticks with this,
Yeah.
it gets dissolved.
It's forced out of you. The analogy that we all use, again, across so many faith systems, is this idea of the mirror. I think to our own AJC masses, when we're doing the Eucharist, you hold the Eucharist aloft and you say, I am a mirror to those that see me. And, that same sort of image comes up again in Zen Buddhism and other religions, where you get this idea of your practice becomes a mirror in which you're forced to look at yourself. And I don't care how much you love yourself, looking in the mirror is still a very difficult thing, especially when you see yourself at your most base. Even the most beautiful people I know will look in the mirror and say, oh, I can't look until I've done my hair and my makeup, whatever it is. We hate to see ourselves first thing in the morning. Because this is who we are. And that's what the practice does. As Bishop Laney said, you start to see things where you say, oh, I really don't like this about myself. And you're forced to confront it. To me, it's the most difficult path to take, again, compared to this idea of, if I just follow the rules, somebody's going to come and save me. Whatever it may be. In the Buddhist path, we have something called the Bodhisattva vow. This idea that eventually you will take a vow that says you vow to save all beings. But before you can even consider taking that vow, you have to spend a long time taking a look at what it takes to save yourself.
Absolutely.
And that's the hardest part of the work.
I would absolutely agree. And we are going to have to wind up this discussion, but we will be continuing in the After Dark podcast. And I'm looking forward to that very much with Deacon DiGilio and Bishop Canterbury and Father Tony. And that show will be available probably sometime Sunday evening at the Gnostic Wisdom Network. .net, and also on our Facebook page. Now, I do have a couple of questions for our listeners and our viewers. Do you think that Gnosticism is narcissistic? Do you think it's a narcissistic path? Do you think there's a danger or an increased danger of narcissism developing on the Gnostic path? Let us know whether you think this is the case or not. Also, Deacon DiGilio, could you briefly update us on the Johannite Conclave that's coming up?
Yes, the Johannite Conclave is coming up in May, and I'm probably going to blank on the dates. It's roughly May 21st to May 28th, somewhere in there. I'm actually not the planner this year, which is a good feeling. It's happening in Pennsylvania this year, in Harrisburg. So it's an exciting change of pace that we get to go to the Keystone State. But again, we have a week of just fellowship and learning and praxis,
Sure.
Good practice tips planned. So anybody interested in Gnosticism is, of course, welcome to read more about it by going to the johannite.org site, where you can find the conclave link, and there's plenty of information there.
Great.
Awesome.
Also, you have a parish in Chicago. Can you tell us a little bit about that as well, and how people in the Chicago area can get in touch with you and attend your masses?
Absolutely. Here in Chicago, we have the parish of St. John the Revelator, and currently we meet the second Sunday of the month in the evening. You can find out more about us online at St. John Revelator, and that's STJOHN, so stjohnrevelator.org.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you both.
Yes. And we look forward to the After Dark podcast. So again, folks, thank you so much for joining us, and we really appreciate it, and we look forward to seeing you all next week. Take care.
Good night, everyone.
Bye now.
This has been a production of the Gnostic Wisdom Network. For more information about this and all of GWN's programming, please visit gnosticwisdom.net. The opinions expressed in the show do not necessarily reflect the opinions of GWN, the Apostolic Johannite Church, or any other organization. This has been released under a Creative Commons Attribution Share Other organization. This has been released under a Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike 4.0 international license and is brought to you by the generous support of our patrons. To support our programs and become a patron, please visit patreon.com/Gnostic. That's patreon.com/GNOSTIC.